So, good evening and welcome to a new public event of the summer school. Good evening. Today we are very happy to have with us Denise Ferreira da Silva. Denise is an academic and at the same time a practicing artist. Let me say that she is a major and original voice in debates surrounding race and coloniality, as well as Black feminism. Original voice. We are very honored, I repeat, to have Denise with us tonight. She's also part of amazing networks. When I first met her several years ago, it happened through the mediation of common friends, Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, who participated in our summer school last year. So there is also this element of continuity. I will just mention one book by Denise that was important also for me. The title of the book is Towards a Global Idea of Race, and it came out in 2007. I think that Denise has a book coming out in the next months entitled Unpayable Debt. And as far as I understand, the topic of that unpayable debt will be addressed also in her talk tonight. The title of the talk is Negative Accumulation, the Racial Event or that which happens without time. Please.
Yes, thank you, Sandro, for the invitation to be here on the Light to St. Lawrence, and thanks Lawrence and Ranji and others involved in the Academy. Yes, it's very nice to be here with you. I prepared the text to read so as it's more organized than if I just try to speak about it. After recalling the wounds left by the whip on the bodies of enslaved persons, and noting that, I quote, these undecipherable markings on the captive body render a kind of hieroglyphic of the flesh, end quote, Hortense Pillars proceeds to ask, I quote again, we might as well ask if this phenomenon of marking and branding actually transfer from one generation to another, finding its various symbolic substitutions in an efficacy of meanings that repeat the initiating moments, end quote. A question to which I answer with a resounding yes, and it's yes because I cannot but find that which requested and authorized that violence, that marking and branding. I find it similarly operating in major global events of the past 2 decades or so, like George W. Bush's war on terror, the global economic crisis of 2007-2008, Europe's refugee crisis, which has been ongoing for nearly a decade now, and the pandemic of the past 2 years, and of course, the unmistakable effects of global warming. Without doubt, as Pillars highlights, the symbolic plays a crucial part in how these events are understood, conceived, explained, and/or justified. However, it is, as it was, only one moment of occurrence, of recurrence, I should say, of the violence that founds the political architecture these events express. That this repetition occurs is what the phrase negative accumulation captures. And this very repetition is the modality of subjugation the image of the racial event has been assembled to express. That similarity, the image of the recurring founding event, I find also features in this global event as violence, the letting die of refugees in the Mediterranean Sea and of essential workers during the pandemic, and indifference as applied to the decisions regarding COVID-19 pandemic, the choice to save the economy and not the lives of BIPOC persons. In both events, I find that the violence and indifference with which these deaths have been met, that these reveal an excess. The excess, which is the key that links the colonial juridic economic context, conquest, settlement, and enslavement, with today's operations of racial and cultural difference. That is, as a global political symbol of raciality, that is, as a global political symbolic tool set. For access, that which cannot return within the acceptable working of things, and acceptable as that which is in time, of time, as that which is measurable, but also the measure. That has as its consequences, both the exhaustion that has marked the daily existence of Black, Indigenous, and migrant populations, as well as the accretion of harmful gases that is raising the overall temperature of the planet atmosphere. So what I will do in this presentation today is to introduce, it's just an outline of the argument that this access cannot be missed when thinking proceeds without presupposing, rather when it moves against time. When the yes answer to Hortense Pillar's rhetorical question considers the transfer she wonders about as that of an intrinsic, constituent material capacity, that is an utter materiality. And as I do so, I also introduce the racial event as an image that grasps the political operation of that which repeats the founding violence. When describing what this transfer of material capacity affords and exposes, the racial event shows coloniality as a juridical modality and raciality as a symbolic arsenal at work in global subjugation. Something it reads as an effect of the complex formation that is the liberal political architecture. How precisely this formation rehearses the efficacy Hortense Pillars mentions in the opening quote is something I captured with the phrase negative accumulation, a phrase that, as a descriptor, allows for the appreciation of how coloniality and raciality as liberal operators have continuously functioned in capital accumulation, and as such, in the very material constitution of the global condition, the events I mentioned before express. Why negative accumulation? This phrase I find invites a shift in thinking in line with Black, Indigenous, anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist radical traditions. As an image, it captures the trajectory of Black and Indigenous peoples of the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific in the past 400 years or so. As such, like the image of unpayable debt, it supports the statement that decolonization is the only appropriate descriptor for the goal of any ethical political program that confronts global capital. Both figures, negative accumulation and unpayable debt, to be sure, support the argument that capital accumulation has always needed the dislocation, appropriation, and extraction of territories and bodies across the planet. that is that the juridic economic formation state capital, which has been a global planetary formation in all its guises, as commercial, industrial, financial information, that capital lives off extraction and expropriation, of the brutal and calculated appropriation, to recall C.L.R. James, of bodies and territories. Both negative accumulation and unpayable debt I offer belong with the contributions of a number of authors that I'm not going to mention now, but I think we can talk about them later. And those contributions combined, I find, they spell out the kind of anti-colonial materialist critique that is able to expose how colonial and racial violence are constitutive of liberal state capital, both in its democratic and authoritarian presentations. So let me just briefly comment on two events where this similarity exposes coloniality and raciality working with cis-heteropatriarchy in the matrix of global capital. First, the global economic crisis of 2008, 2007, 2008, that was blamed on, and it's still going. So why give it a date? I don't know. But anyway, that crisis was blamed on in the US at least, it was blamed on Black and migrant persons and family whose lack of equity forced them to take the so-called subprime loans. Their negative value as economic subjects made them infamous mortgage-based securities. Now the financial instruments composed with these loans, their lack of equity made them, these instruments, excessively valuable. That excess, the explanation went, led to the near collapse of the global economy when those holding the instruments tried to cash them. And then there is the pandemic of the last 2 years. And here again, in the US, Black, Indigenous, and migrant persons and populations are the most likely to contract and experience severe symptoms of the disease. Why? Due to their physical condition, pre-existing health conditions of high blood pressure, diabetes, etc., and social situation, their housing, employment types, that is, low payment jobs in transportation, health, and care industries. In sum, their precarious social conditions render them excessively more vulnerable to the novel virus. Never asked about either the economic crisis or the pandemic was the obvious question. Why do these non-white persons and populations hold such debts, both financial and corporal? It is not asked because the racial dialectic, the ruling explanation for racial subjugation, when considering why the prevalence of these negative social conditions, the racial dialectic provides an answer. That these are the effects of natural, in the sense of scientifically verifiable datum, natural collective responses to racial cultural difference, which is also considered a datum. That is, these exclusionary ideas and practices are the cause for this deficit. So when doing so, the racial dialectic takes attention away from the political context and renders racial subjugation a matter of group relations as the fact of unbecoming instinctual or cultural responses. Though whatever results from such natural reactions might have its origins in time, might have a beginning of sorts, it does not belong to time because the cause, non-white, non-European racial and cultural attributes, that cause does not change. We are in the realm of necessity, not liberty, or to use Hegelian language, of nature, of spirit as nature, not as history. In short, this explanation places the causes of racial subjugation and with it also colonial domination out of linear time. But by saying this, I'm not signaling a move to write racial subjugation in linear time, because the arsenal of raciality functions so well as a political operator precisely because it is not a referent of linear time. And that's true also for its historical versions, and we can talk about it, what I mean by that later. as an explanatory tool that gives an immediate, natural, necessary justification for what it describes, raciality has been an efficient facilitator of capital accumulation over the past 150 years or so. And it's precisely because it grasps what does not unfold in time. And precisely because it grasps what does not unfold in time, the racial event as an analytical tool images racial subjugation as an operation of the liberal political architecture. Something that can be appreciated when one considers that accumulation of capital also includes what has been designated as a negative value, that is the excess that does not enter in the calculation of capital, but it is evident in the sheer economic dispossession of Black subprime borrowers, undocumented migrant and made refugee populations, and essential workers. And is there precisely because it is not in time, and as such is not measurable, though it certainly is included in the exchange value of the commodities. Refusing the explanation that the prevailing construction of Black persons as immoral subjects and the violence and indifference they experienced was due to an instinctual reaction on the part of white Americans. In his classic 1881 text, Frederick Douglass states, I quote, "Out of the death of slavery has come this prejudice and this color line," end quote. Which he elaborates by saying that, I quote again, "Every man who had 1,000 invested had 1,000 reasons for painting the Black man as fit only for slavery. The holders of $20, $100 million worth of property in human chattels procured the means of influencing press, pulpit, and politician, and through these instrumentalities, they belittled our virtues and magnified our vices, and have made us odious in the eyes of the world," end quote. Foregrounding the political, juridical, economic context against the natural, social scientific explanations that focus on the type or effects of group relations, Douglas' account of racial subjugation outlines what I call the racial event. This analytical tool yields a complex image of the liberal political formation where it identifies two modalities of juridic governance: the polity, ruled by the force of law, and the colony, ruled by the force of the gun, as Fanon describes it. Douglas' articulation of the phrase color line differs radically from the one prevailing in the 20th century, which describes describes the liberal political architecture as a fourfold formation gathered over the past centuries, and it grasps similar mobilizations of its juridic, economic, and ethic moments across what we'd call history. And in doing so, it targets the sequentiality, the temporality characteristic of post-Enlightenment thinking that organized the historical materialist account of the political. Because it is precisely this sequential thinking, as Glenn Coulthard argues, that accounts for the disavowal of the colonial as juridic economic features such as conquest, settlement, and slavery in the Marxist critique of capitalism. Another materialist tool which displays sequential thinking and the presumption of separability it imposes and necessitates, the racial event grasps major components of any episode of racial violence, which it takes as prime matter for thinking. So basically, it reads what happens as always a redecomposition. And then I have to say that this is not Marx's materiality of social structures, but what's redecomposed as matter here is conceived as quantically and cosmically, that is in its utter materiality, and as such as always already deeply implicated, that is entangled, and in its indistinction with energy. And every redecomposition is also a singular assembling of what has composed and what has happened and what will compose what is yet to happen, but also what may never become actual, meaning what may never come in space-time. When the racial event describes the moment of occurrence, distinguished from the site of occurrence as a redecomposition, and for this reason, similar to and implicated with other, it does so, it shows it as similar to and implicated with other actual, possible, potential, and virtual compositions. And then, of course, when doing so, the racial event images recomposes any context as a fractal figure because instead of tracking the causal linear connection, it gathers because it attends to that which repeats in different moments and modes of presentation. In short, designed to disorder sequentiality, the racial event recalls Benjamin's rendering of figurality. So let me illustrate this by returning to Douglas' statement on the color line. Read with the racial event, it yields a fourfold image in which instead of the effect of natural causation, racial subjugation becomes a political operation that is one in which economic, $1,000 economic interest met by a juridic modality, in this case slavery, would animate symbolic strategies, that is a statement that attributes to Black persons vices and not virtues. So there is a connection between the symbolic and the ethical in this context. The image shows the four moments of the political as they are activated in racial subjugation. It recalls how the racial operates so effectively precisely because it mobilizes the symbolic force of scientific universality, necessity, as expressed in the term natural. It mobilizes necessity in the writing of a social moral subject that does not share in the distinguishing attributes of humanity and subjectivity. As I argue elsewhere, it also shows how raciality, the arsenal of necessity, has ruled the modern ethical text, along with the notion of humanity, which is obviously the ethical figure that belongs in time and the one whose deeds express liberty and equality. So though capital has shape-shifted over the past 500 years or so, probably less, the racial event recalls an authority that carries the ethical force of property, that is the force of necessity, of self-preservation protection, which authorizes both morally and juridically total violence. And that force of property has remained fundamentally the same in all dominant guises of capital. So perhaps I could say it differently. So my point here is that the racial event exposes how the same juridic economic substructure assured the expropriation of the productive capacity of native, colonized, settled lands and slave labor, which constitute the matter that is the life and blood of global state capital. Negative accumulation as a descriptor becomes unavoidable when the racial event images the economic scene of value and yields an image of capital accumulation without linear time. That is, without the onto-epistemological pillars it supports, and those pillars are separability, determinacy, and sequentiality. How? Okay, so let me return to the classic original presentation of the Critique of Capital, meaning Marx. As you know, well, there's no need to make a case for the centrality of time in Marx's analysis of capital. It is both the determining, scientific, and the delimiting historical operative in accumulation of capital. There is no surplus value if part of the social time needed to produce exchange value is not retained by the capitalism. Time is also the horizon for distinguishing capitalism as a particular mode of production in the succession. Or another way of saying that, time both the limits historically and the terms, the particularity of the capitalist mode of creation, of value creation, that is the production of value and the accumulation of capital. With the racial event, however, it's possible to grasp how the accumulation of capital also includes a value that is not created or produced in as time. And this is what I call a negative value, or the excess, which is the value that is not contracted agreeably under an agreement between willing parties, but extracted forcefully under the gun, title, and the whip. Reading Capital with the racial event, one finds that the colony and slave labor, one finds the colony and slave labor doubly negated through the same fourfold formation Douglas finds operating in the subjugation of Black Americans in the 1880s, as not juridically, that is, as opposed to free in the ethical sense, or free labor or wage labor, and for this reason as known, scientifically productive of surplus value, and that's the economic aspect. That is basically as not counting in the accumulation of capital. That is so, however, because for Marx, slave labor is not measurable labor. It's not abstracted as something that happens in time. The slave and the conquered soil she works on for Marx is fully and purely use value. She's like the cotton that enters in the production of the yarn. She's not like the spindle because that is that labor, and there's such some exchange value in the machine. She's not translatable into units of time and then divided up and calculated in terms of what returns to worker as wage and what is retained by the capitalist as profit, which can be saved, spent, or returned to production as capital. The core distinction here is ethical, and it's given by the notion of liberty. Only biological humans produce value, but only historical, rational, and self-determined humans produce exchange value. Slaves are humans, but not free. Therefore, they are and produce use value. They are raw materials, but they do not produce exchange value. They do not produce commodities. This is the case because the first gesture, which is the same in every liberal account of the prime juridic relation, the agreement among those sitting on the long table or standing in the public square, the consent to have the product of one's labor taken by others freely through a juridical agreement. So the prime juridical relation is there because the signature of a contract, okay, that prime juridical relation is not there in the case of the slave because the signature of a contract does not take place between the slave owner and the slave laborer. So that's Marx, but I'm proposing something else. What if, ignoring the juridical distinction, one assumed that insofar as she is a human being, transforming raw materials and other means of production through the expenditure of her vital force, transforming them into commodities, sugar, cotton, etc., the slave is living labor, and as such, she has productive capacity, and thus she's not a thing, mere use value or raw material, as Marx sometimes implies. So my point is that on the positive side of the accumulation of money to be turned into capital, an accumulation enabled by slavery, that is an excess that it's not registered in the classic historical materialist account of capitalist accumulation. This excess is the value of the worker wage of her labor time, which is retained by her owner. And then, of course, you know that the transference in Marx's account is not exhaustive. What the worker sells is labor time, not the productive capacity itself. In any case, that excess, which I call a total value retained by the slave owner, corresponds to the scarcity, the sheer economic dispossession, marking the temporal trajectory of descendants of slaves, as well as of other former colonized subject. That is what I call negative accumulation, or the accumulation of a deficit, economic, that is political. And that is what the tools of raciality, the prevailing account of racial subjugation, has transubstantiated into a natural deficit or defect, but which is nothing more than the effect of colonial expropriation and later juridic, symbolic, and everyday violence and indifference. What the racial event shows is how, for instance, not only the descendants of slaves were expropriated of the total value created by their labor and their ancestors' labors, and also how, and as Douglas noted already in the late 19th century, how they were also comprehended by a political symbolic arsenal, raciality, which prefigures the very ethical distinction at the core of Marx's original presentation of historical materialism. And it does so by attributing the causes of their economic dispossession to an inherent natural, moral, and intellectual defect. And in doing so, it allows us to consider how the lack of equity of the subprime borrowers and the comorbidities that render the coronavirus more lethal to Black, Indigenous, and migrant persons in the US, how this exposes an accumulation of processes of economic expropriation and juridical domination, slavery, colonial domination, criminalization, incarceration. So negative accumulation, otherwise an oxymoron, adequately describes the global condition as the proper context for analyzing this crisis, as well as the European refugee crisis and global warming. For what slavery, for instance, as a modality of expropriation has produced, is an economic subject who, like the subprime borrowers, owns minus the total value created by their ancestors' productive capacity, precisely because their labor never counted as their property in the way that Marx says that of the wage laborers does. Let me quote from Glissant's Poetics of Relation. I quote, "Whenever a fleet of ships gave chase to slave ships, it was easiest just to lighten the boat by throwing cargo overboard, weighing it down with balls and chains. These underwater signposts mark the course between the Gold Coast and the Leeward Islands. In actual fact, the abyss is a tautology, the entire ocean, the entire sea gently collapsing in the end into pleasures of sand, make one vast beginning, but a beginning whose time is marked by these balls and chains gone green." End quote. What I read in Glissant's words is a description of that which the racial event seeks to capture, the generative abyss, that is, the depths of the sea, but also the expanse of the sky. The racial event as an image of the political relocates the founding scene, its founding scene. Instead of the image of property-holding patriarchs sitting around a table or standing in a public square, it finds it or founds it out in the sea, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, at the crossing point where all routes of the triangular trade meet, where slaves, raw materials, and agricultural and industrial commodities meet to spell profit, that is capital, where both what has counted and not counted, including those who jumped or were thrown overboard and drowned, they enter in the composition of state capital. Foregrounding the founding violence that enabled the liberal political formation, that is, attending to how it's made possible, as Glissant says, from the sea, one can appreciate the double forced displacement of persons in the Americas and in the African continent, which made their territories and bodies available for extraction of calor and labor. From there, in addition to the image of the polity, the analysis must attend to the operations of coloniality as a juridic modality of governance and raciality as a symbolic arsenal, both operations in the liberal matrix. One also attends to how both are constituted by and constitutive of its architecture and its operational moments, and those are the juridic, economic, symbolic, and ethic. Every instance of the racial event includes those that have happened in the colonies before and after the racial came to play in the political symbolic role it received in the second half of the 19th century. Each performs this operation and its formal and material components, the choreography that yields more total violence and indifference. Each iteration, it shows, enacts, supports, or authorizes total violence in the protection of property and liberty, which was acquired due to the double force displacement. Which is also the juridic economic form that joins liberal state and capital. So let me return to one of the main implications of this highlighting of Marx's double negation of slave labor as productive capital, that is of exchange value, as not productive capital, negation of unproductive of exchange value to be appropriated. Ethics, juridically, the slave is not free and cannot alienate her labor, and economically, ethically, slave labor is non-productive of exchange value because the slave is not free. So what I'm highlighting here is how the ethical concept of liberty, of course, along with property, but liberty I'm highlighting now, governs Marx's program, how his critique of capital rehearses the liberal script. We need a different story. So let me close with a few questions that signal what I have in mind when I consider the task. What kind of critique of capital would become possible if one ignored the ethical distinction and considered both free and non-free labor as productive value of capital? As I said before, what if, when considering the juridic moment, one relocated its founding from the long table occupied by property owners, we relocated it to the raging seas, to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? What if finally we conceive of existence at the quantic moment, and then acknowledged that the bodies of the slaves and indigenous territories, the expanded potential and kinetic energy in the form of labor and transferred as calor? What if we took them as part of the raw materials that would then be part of the commodities that were used to manufacture, and that would then be transduced into money that was obtained when they were exchanged, and money, part of which was reinvested as capital and so on. When asking this question, I move into a critique of state capital that foregrounds the access, the value not captured by modern analytical tools, that is the total value extracted from conquered territories and enslaved bodies. That profit is first and foremost derived from extraction and expropriation. Extraction from the land as mining and intensive and large scale agricultural production, expropriation of land, the theft of indigenous lands, and the enclosures of the commons, as well as extractions of body from the African continent, but also from there and other parts of the world as people are forced to leave due to environmental and social catastrophes, as well as the wars of global capital, but also expropriation of their material capacity. That obviously is only thinkable because when figuring the accumulation of capital, the racial event grasps it without linearity as given by space-time. What becomes possible when thinking does not carry the infrastructures of modern thought, separability, determinacy, sequentiality. Well, the connections between back then and right now, and between over there and right here, become unmistakable. For instance, knowing that Liverpool merchants' profits from slave trade enabled the emergence of modern banking in Britain in the 17th century does not expose how the racial links these profits and later Black insurrections in Liverpool, Rio de Janeiro, in Minneapolis, and Los Angeles. How it doesn't show how the economic dispossession and juridical domination, the policing, unleashing them are part of the same assemblage that is global capital. For that to be thinkable, we need to be able to imagine that all of this is taking place, that it all happens without time. For historical materialism fails to apprehend the racial as a political concept because in its historical stage, property of means of production is figured in sequential time. That is as something that takes different abstract forms across in time. Each successive economic form is contingent upon new social conditions that are separate from the preceding in time or contemporaneous forms in space. Now, this is operative both in the moment of the analysis and in the analytical tools, which cannot image the symmetry captured by the racial event. Not surprisingly, like liberal thinkers, most historical materialists of today ignore the workings of the racial as much as Marx did over a century ago. When the racial event is leading to registered similarities, such as the ones with which I opened this talk, the similarities regarding Black and migrant and Black and indigenous persons, how they have been the worst affected by the global economic crisis and the global pandemic of 2 years. When the racial event captures them, it fractures and releases the pieces to further redecomposition. It gathers an image and immediately exposes the global present as composed by each and every previous iteration, and as such, as the accumulation of excess as laws of both what counts and does not count as value, as well as all that is wasted, and the noxious effects of incessant extraction and expropriation that now accumulate in the Earth's troposphere, which is bringing about what may be an already irreversible and deadly planetary reconfiguration. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, Denise, for this kind of challenging talk. The floor is open now for questions and comments. So I guess people have to reflect a bit after this intense talk. So I will start and I will ask a question regarding the racial event, its temporality, and the kind of articulation between what you call negative accumulation and the accumulation of capital. First of all, from the angle of temporality, because listening to you, I have the impression that what you call the racial event is something that in a way is frozen in time. It happened and it continued to repeat itself without changing its status, while of course the accumulation of capital has a very different temporality. I mean, so a first question is about, I repeat, the articulation between these different temporalities. Then I have more, but I will start with this one. Do you want to collect a couple? Okay. Okay. But you need the mic.
Yes, I need to answer each question because I forget. I have bad memory. Hence, I look for repetitions. Yeah, so I was actually thinking about it, have been obsessing about it lately in how to make the connection, because the racial event is an image, or maybe I should say is a tool that allows you to gather the elements that are repeated in major moments, right? In moments of crisis, in moments when some certain decisions are needed in order so as state capital can proceed as usual in a redistribution of losses that always affect mostly descendants of formerly enslaved populations and former colonized populations. So the racial event is in that moment, a decision. It appears in court decisions all the time. I found some examples in the captain of a slave ship, just find the fact that why they killed some revolting slaves who were revolting. Now negative accumulation is then the effect of the elimination of those whose political subordination or political domination are captured by the racial event. And the distinction there is obviously is an analytical one, right? Negative accumulation is a descriptor of the process of capital accumulation that addresses the question of what happens to that or those that have been extracted, excessively extracted or excessively exploited, for which I call expropriated. So another way of saying that is that the racial event allows for an examination of the corner of the liberal political architecture where ethics, the ethical and the juridical operate, while negative accumulation allows for examination of that corner where the economic and the juridic operate. But they're both analytical tools. And in that sense, well, no, I'm not gonna offer this one, maybe if I have to.
Thank you. Thank you. This was a fascinating paper. My question is about whether we should be doing away completely with this notion of an event as an extraordinary thing that happened out and therefore it's sort of exceptional. Which is sort of what Badiou does, yes? Badiou's event, yes, kind of a something like a God-given thing that happens. Could be a revolution, it could be something else. But I'm wondering whether we should do away with this elitist and momentary thinking, and whether you should be thinking, and the racial event in particular, which is what you're doing, is a continuous. It's not something which is there once and for all. It happened, it started at one point, it's true. But to focus on the event isn't to lose of how the event is being reproduced and becomes ordinary and becomes normalized in a daily context in the way that we think of capital and accumulation. Thank you.
So, so you got my being annoyed with Badiou, because the racial event is that which happens without time and all the time. So actually, the first time I wrote about the racial event, I was precisely writing against the event as something extraordinary, and thinking of the event as that which happens. In the case of the racial event, it happens in the particular way that it does. But it's not supposed to be something extraordinary, but it's named racial because of the particular ways in which those four moments have to be set up, so as necessity becomes the justification for racial violence or for indifference. And then but that is exceptional, right? I mean, in a way, the racial event, another conversation that I could have with, the exception people, Agamben. So the racial event is also about the fact that that which is called exceptional is actually functional and operational as part of the political architecture of, of the past many hundred years.
Thank you, Denise. I really enjoyed the very dense and thought-provocative presentation. I have one first question that's related to the last comment about your definition of event. And I know you're playing with the paradoxical meaning of it. Are you inspired by Hannah Arendt's definition? Because it's not historical per se, or it's in a way treated as both historical and removed from history because of the frozen dimension that Sandro mentioned in the first one. And the second one is maybe a clarification for me. I see an opposition or a symmetrical construction, analytical construction between the negative accumulation and sequential thinking. That's a positive dimension, right? Can we think them together? It's like the sequential thinking as the white, historicized notion of capitalism and exploitation and colonialism. And on the other side, like in the bottom of the sea, you know, the negative accumulation that's invisible and untranslatable into discourse. Is it correctly? Am I like reading you well and hearing you well? Maybe not.
Okay, so
Thank you.
Let me begin with the second one. I'm not producing the dichotomy. I'm identifying two moments, and what I'm interested is in collapsing the distinction between that which is considered as part of accumulation that is in time and that which is out of time. So because there is a third movement that is not in this paper, but it's in the new book that stays, I mean, it is signaled here, but basically I'm describing the two moments as proper moments of the liberal political architecture, let's put it this way. What is in sequential time, which is what makes sense, what is comprehensible, what is counted, what counts even in our political discourse, right, as proper political, and what's not, because it is what is being designated as natural, right, which has come, worked through by scientific tools, and I'm just bringing them all together as part of the same context. As to Arendt, you said Arendt, notion of the event. Yeah, no, it's not. No. I was basically just irritated with, not necessarily Badiou, but some people who quote him a lot when I was writing about the refugee crisis, and it was about the crisis, and I don't even remember what it was about. It was in 2016, 17. And then I thought, I'm going to take this event and make it into something else. But the dichotomy you identified is a dichotomy that is inherent to our thinking that I was bringing out. Yeah.
Thank you, Denise. It was a really great talk. One of the things that interested me was the kind of your final agenda of points to explore. And one of them was what happened to the question of value if you consider free as well as unfree labor. And my question is that obviously from the kind of materialist perspective that you were describing, there's no such a thing as a free labor, in the sense that the free and unfree labor are part of the same package. So how I'm thinking about, you've been writing about freedom, and in what way this idea of the racial event, or even the idea of excess, points toward the freedom that is not already captured by capital.
I'm going to ask you, Mal, to repeat the last part of the question, because I think I missed something key. I'm
just try to think how would you elaborate a notion of freedom that is not captured by capital, and in relationship also to the notion, for instance, of excess, which I think you write in other contexts.
I know you asked me the question of freedom. I usually stay away from that question. So I have been talking about liberty these days, so nobody asks me about freedom and emancipation, just as given. But that wasn't just a joke or a way of avoiding the question. I do not actually spend much time thinking about freedom, but I am more interested in the possibility of not only thinking, but also of, of a sociality, but more so even of a sensibility for which freedom in thought as self-determination is not the defining element, because it is that is what accounts for the founding violence. Because that presupposes the necessity of self-preservation and protection that authorize the violence. Now, if we can describe existence without the demand for self-preservation, without presupposing self-preservation, which I think we can, while obviously I'm beginning with, I'm proposing a different beginning of a different story of the political that begins with violence. That does not necessarily means that violence will continue as a descriptor of our social conditions and the ways in which the original violence of classic political philosophy continues as our description. So one of the elements of that thinking is that I kind of bring out here I mentioned in this talk, is this very notion of utter materiality as a descriptor for all that exists and has existed and is yet to exist. Beginning with materiality as such, and not with the other three ways in which we usually think in terms of forms or in terms of purpose or in terms of efficient causality, might allow us for describe existence in some other way. Not fundamentally without violence, but without have violence as foundational in that. But this is a longer, is a longer answer. It deserves a longer answer. I'm just going to say this, I should say.
Hello, we are part of a school that is trying to think about questions that kind of also be raised in cartographic terms or in visual, very different means. And I was wondering in that framework, if the role of, how do you negotiate, or how talks, written form, artistic project, kind of compose, decompose, recompose on your own work? If you see it that way, if it works that way or not at all.
Sorry, I missed most of what you said. Can you just stand up or something that we...
Sorry, I can't take my mask.
That's okay. So it's slow if you speak slowly, because...
Yes.
Really
okay, we are in a summer school that works with questions and trying to pose questions in different forms, right? And how by posing these questions in different forms, questions kind of change, feed off each other, etc. So I was wondering on your fractal thinking, composition, recomposition, decomposition, if writing form, talking or talks and artistic projects feed each other, if there is a way in which this happens, if it makes sense to you anyway whatsoever. Thank you.
I'm not going to ask you to, so you're wondering if these propositions are, I just can't get the last thing that you say. It's horrible. It's not your fault. It's weird that I can't hear well. So you're wondering if these things that I'm talking about, composition, decomposition, etc., if wondering about what about them?
About your questions in written form, artistic projects, and talks.
About how they would inform these praxis, this academic way of doing things. Thank you for repeating it so many times. Well, I think I kind of do it, right? I mean, in the writing itself, I am violating all kinds of things that are not supposed to be done. Right, you know, copy editors hate me, especially when I send back saying I'm not changing this because that's how it should show in writing. And I'm sure I'm not answering your question in the way I should, but I'm just going to talk about it. How I want to talk about it, because after all, you're students, and you have a bunch of professors here who could change things a bit in the sense of actually creating conditions both in and outside of the classroom for experimentation and even for improvisation. So one of the pieces that I enjoyed the most to write, and I enjoy it even more because I could have the title be an equation, which is published in an art venue, right? It's not an academic text, but I know that there are so many academics who go to that text precisely because I created an object, an artistic object as an equation that makes a point that if I were to make that point writing, I would write 1,000 pages and I wouldn't make the point in the way that the equation does. So yes, so I think along with the shifts that, you know, they may be called metaphysical because they are philosophical shifts, there are things that we can do here and now in terms of how we present arguments, right? Not so much making the argument. The argument is old. It's been old for a long time, but in the form of presentation that I do, but then you have to go through tenure, right? Be threatened not to get tenure because you misbehave until you know, we find ourselves, oh, now they let me. But yeah, so anyway.
Hi, Professor Denise. My name is Anderson, and after your lecture, I'm left with the image of Dana from Kindred. I tried to think of the negative event, over the negative accumulation and the racial event with the example of Dana and her coming back and forth in time, struggling to keep her ancestor alive. To a certain extent, I was thinking if, in the case of Dana, she's in the 70s and going to 19th and then come back, if the negative accumulation in her case would be sequential. But you often refer to the notion of fractal time. So could you please elaborate a bit more on the implications of fractal time on negative accumulation, please?
So you know that I have written with Kindred. Yeah, so you know what I'm doing there, okay. Well, it's more like fractal thinking, right? Which in a way is, can be deployed as a way of collapsing sequential time. In the moment when sequential time, you know, needs to be collapsed, to collapse. We need to confront sequential time and dissolve it. So that's in the task of critique, more so than in the of speculation, right? I haven't moved to the speculative side. I mean, I think I did in the book. I do at the end of it, but for the most part, just think in terms of critique. But I have an image for the fractal thinking that I don't know if you heard me talking about it. The image of the banana. So I was part of an interdisciplinary group of scholars at UBC, and we had to spend a whole year together being interdisciplinary and, working together. And I had to introduce what I do in 1 minute. And then I thought I couldn't, obviously. So I thought of the banana. So I had this image of the banana, which my grandmother, in her backyard, she had banana trees. So I grew up with banana trees as being things that it's something that is part of the Brazilian landscape. But we know that the banana was brought to the Americas and pretty much everywhere by the Portuguese, who brought it from Southeast Asia to the African continent, and then it came to the Americas, right? So that is a historic aspect of the bananas, that if you grow up having bananas in the backyard, you may not know, and then say, oh, they have bananas in Thailand, who knows? But anyway. But you know that banana is also a unit of measurement for radiation poisoning. So when you visit particle physics labs, CERN or like Triumph at UBC, they tell you that you get some radiation, but it's less than a banana. And it's an official measurement, and it is so because of the potassium 56 that it is in the banana that is radioactive. It's decaying. And that potassium was created in a supernova about 10 billion years ago. And it's the same potassium, it's the same element, the same cosmic element that we find in the bananas across the planet, which is also why banana is so good for your heart, because of that potassium. So it has this organic role. So you get the banana, you can look at the banana and look at a banana breakfast. You can look at the banana and look at the cosmic, quantic, historic, and organic at the same time. So if we can look at anything, in the same way. And that's how the mobilization of fractal thinking can work, both on the one hand, critically, in the writing of a critique of, this return to agriculture that we are living in this moment, and the consequences it has, both environmental consequences and economic consequences. But we can also begin to speculate about anything that exists on this planet that, also is made out of things that originated in the supernova, that have, can be looked at historically, like the copper in my computer and in my sink. That takes me to King Leopold and the atrocities of the late 19th century, to the wars of capital in the DRC this moment, right? So it's a way of looking at what already exists and bringing those things together. Again, I don't think I answered exactly your question, but just because I just can't hear everything, but thank you.
Thank you, Professor. It was a fascinating talk. I would like to know if for any case you were inspired by Etienne Balibar, specifically his book of violence and on violence, from the lectures from, I think, 89, where he conceives extreme violence and cruelty as something that's thought is idealized as outside history and outside politics, because he defines broadly violence, extreme violence, as something as the denial of the recognition of the other, where you cannot have an authentic relationship with the other, and therefore you cannot relate to the other politically, ethically, and historically. And he proposed that violence in many, this extreme violence, it cannot be changed. So how, considering this idea of racial event as something that happens without time, how we think about political change, or if it is actually helpful to think about that anyway.
Funny, I could hear most of what you said. So maybe because I can hear better from this side. I don't know this text by Balibar, you said, Etienne Balibar. When I'm thinking of racial violence, I'm thinking both with Fanon, but also, and with the Spillers, but also with police brutality, which is the thing that moves my thinking. My area of work is critical legal theory, and my emphasis has been for the past many years, police brutality. But one thing I think is different, given how you describe Balibar argument there, is that in my view, the violence doesn't come between the I and the other, but violence is constitutive of both positions, right? So the possibility for extreme violence is given in the moment of production of that other, that the killing of whom is authorized, given like jus necessitatis, like, no question about that. So I think that's the difference, but I don't know the text. So yeah, I can say more.
Political change.
Political change, like the question of freedom. Okay. Well, it seems that the liberal political architecture that has given us the idea that change is possible, it itself doesn't change. The same elements are mobilized over and over again. So we might change the political, right? And then see what happens, and then see if change, once the political itself is redescribed, and social, and our social, I don't want to use social, but our existence is described in a different way. Political change, well, maybe another way of saying that, the shift has to be prior, earlier, formally earlier than the political. By the time we get to political change, there is so much that is unchangeable, because the infrastructure, it remains the same. And so every time this infrastructure is activated, we find ourselves like, what? Abortion rights have been outlawed in the US now? How is it possible? It's the same way that was possible the attacks on affirmative action before, and everything that is the elimination of voting rights in 2015. The fail-safe in the liberal political architecture is always allowing for it to be reorganized and whatever. So, yeah.
Can I come back on the racial event? Have you thought about how the racial event is reconstituted every time there's a pushback? Every time a body is killed or pushed back or excluded from a territory, there's a reconstitution, a reenactment of the racial event. And this has been the result of the way in which what Sandro has been talking about, the erosion of sovereignty, of the capitalization of sovereignty, and which is very much part of the process of this reconstitution. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about this too. Thank you.
Well, because the thinking started with, with critical legal theorizing, and in particular with the case of police brutality against Black people, and then the criminalization of, Bush war, discourse on war on terrorists, and the criminalization of the political that took place 20 years ago, and so on and so forth. I'm always thinking about the decision, right? To me, is the moment the decisions whether they're the decision to shoot or the decision to acquit or the decision is always central in the choreography of the racial event. And that in that sense, yes, it is related to sovereignty, but it's in the moment, right? It is as if there is being a dissolution, or maybe not a dissolution, maybe it's the opposite of a dissolution. But you might think it's more of a distillation of the sovereignty into the decision. And that decision to kill is not inhabited by, I mean, it is made by one that occupies that position, but it's a decision that it's possible because of the script. The script has that place from which, you know, necessity can be called upon as, you know, as even as a lack of, you know, again, I'm not going to volunteer.
So if there are no more questions, I will ask a second one. Picking up again on the issue of labor that was also addressed by Massimiliano, and on the binary, free, unfree labor. You know, I think in Marx, what really matters in free labor is the juridical aspect. The ownership, much more the ownership of labor power, much more than the ethical aspect. But anyway, I think it is important to note that in the last decades, several studies have challenged the binary free and unfree labor, looking at the proliferation of forms of labor between the two poles of free and unfree. I'm thinking of global labor history, of the work of Marcel van der Linden, for instance, but not only that, you know. What I am asking, first of all, myself, is whether the binary free and unfree labor is in a way helpful for us today. You know, just think of migration. You also have this kind of binary, free, forced migration. And the question of freedom is again at stake. But as critical migration scholars demonstrate, there is an expanding gray zone where you cannot say whether a form, a practice of migration is free or forced. And this raises also relevant juridical issues, you know. So, the point is precisely for me this proliferation of forms, both toward the pole of free and toward the pole of unfree labor. So, I mean, if you look at the composition of labor in this city, of dependent labor in this city, you find a wide array of legal and social arrangements, a deep heterogeneity, you know, that challenges the idea that in a city like Bologna, what prevails is free labor, and then maybe you have some unfree labor performed by migrants. It's much more complex. So my question is about the way in which you negotiate this moment of proliferation, you know, and the heterogeneity.
Thank you. I think if we look historically with lots of quotes, because I usually don't speak historically, we'll find that actual conditions of existence are messy, and that the categories, they exist as a way of apprehending certain aspects, but in actuality, in space-time, we have all those differences. Now, as we can describe, find variations of degrees of freedom of labor during slavery, whatever. I think that this is, I absolutely agree with you that the dichotomy, the binary is it's not useful when we are engaged in the description of the actual conditions of existence. Now, what I'm interested in this whole exercise is a few things. I think the main one is the displacing of the prevailing account of racial subjugation that is part of our, unconscious. And I'm displacing it from these naturalized group relations onto the political, what I'm calling the liberal political architecture, in which I find those 4 moments. So now, when I go about doing that displacement, the distinction between free labor and slave labor in Marx is important for several reasons. 2 of them are crucial. Well, maybe 3. One is a bit mean, which has to do with the fact that the realization, which is sad to me, but it's true anyway, I think it's true, that our political discourse is that script, right? This script, which is in which the juridic notion of property and the ethical notion of liberty, which are the same in the juridical lingua, the ethical and the juridic is a little bit, that is what guides that is what guides the whole argument regarding accumulation of capital. That's number 1. So number 2, what interests me here is also the argument for decolonization, which is not so much only, I was trained as a social scientist and I absolutely, completely abandoned it. So I'm not so much interested in the studies that a sociologist like me should be interested in, but I'm more interested in the conditions, in the tools that are available for us to do those descriptions, to do those analyses. And when I focus on that distinction between labor that is defined by contract and labor that is defined by title, in the way in which title, as those people were working at the same time in the 19th century. And that juridic relation of title, along with its ethical meaning on freedom, is what allows for the separation, for the delimitation of what should count in the analysis of capital and not, right? So to me, the elimination of that distinction is crucial, both to my personal intellectual project of shifting the description of racial subjugation, and more generally, in the larger ethical political context, I think it will also be important for that decolonization be taken seriously as a political project that is not only about certain peoples and persons whose lands have been, the descendants of those whose lands have been expropriated and continue to be extracted over and over and over and over again. It's not only about them, but it's also about, it's also about global warming. It's also about the general condition in which we live. So in that sense, labor is actually not the most important category in the analysis, right? That's where I'm moving to. Because production is not the most important one. Extraction has showed itself to be the more consistent and the more damaging in terms of in all levels of our existence. So I begin with that distinction just to go and fundamentally raise and production labor, the very distinction, the whole thing is gotta go.
So thank you very much. No more questions or comments? Maybe yes.
Hi, Professor De Silva. Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate your work. And I feel like you touched on this answer a little bit in your most recent comment, but I wanted to pose it just to see if you had anything to say. But when I originally read the unpayable debt and then listened to when I read the unpayable debt, I immediately thought of the Stuart Hall quote, "Race is the modality in which class is lived." But hearing this talk, I feel like that formation is insufficient. And so what I'm getting from this conversation is that global capital lives off of the total value expropriated from slave labor and land. And I think even in the talk, a rough paraphrase I got and I took note of, is you said the exploitation of the productive capacity of land and labor has served as the blood and life force of capital. So what we see now, or more precisely during financial crisis, is an effect of colonial exploitation, and which I think perhaps rewires and calls into question this very popular Stuart Hall quote, that race is the modality in which classes live, to instead say that capital itself is grounded by racial colonial discourses and practices. And I wanted to know if that's correct, like your work is reimagining such a formulation. And if so, what do you see this new kind of discourse adding to our present understanding of race and class?
Yes, I think, how do I say that? Because those are sociological categories, right? So when we read such a statement that race is one with the ways that, that classes live, it is as if those categories are walking around and they exist in somehow. And then we got into the whole problem of them being one excluding the others, and you need intersectionality, and it becomes a mess because it's a mess made by the fact that those we deploy those categories as if they are, and then so the steps I'm taking is just to treat the categories as such, and then see how they're brought together, especially in this case of thinking of labor class, seeing how it comes together and how actually some adjustment, which is they are crucial, but they are just adjustment in ways in which we read them, or maybe focusing on, as you treat them as such, it's possible to come up with different descriptors, and it's also possible to capture different things without having to wonder whether, race or class or gender or sexuality is the most important. They are categories of knowledge, really, that have become descriptors of, our descriptors, but that's all. I mean, we can live without them too,
Okay. 8:45. I think we can close this really amazing conversation with Denise. And please join me in warmly thanking Denise, and I will see you over the next days.